Hey folks, I've spent the past few months digging into all the most baffling mysteries of the Shakespeare authorship question, and I want to share with you what I've found. Anyone familiar with the case for Edward de Vere knows that scholars have pulled together a mountain of evidence suggesting that Edward de Vere wrote the plays. But the question I'm grappling with today is how exactly Edward de Vere's name got lost to history. And furthermore, how was his image seemingly intentionally replaced with the phony narrative of the man named Will from Stratford-upon-Avon? It's a weird, convoluted story that spans about 200 years. We're going from the Tudor era through the Jacobean, leading almost up to King George III and the American Revolution. This is the proverbial riddle, wrapped in a mystery, inside an enigma, with some conspiracies and a sex scandal thrown in, plus 400 years of playing telephone. I have some new discoveries that I'm really excited to share, but I'll also be recapping some of the coolest work that other scholars have done in recent years so you can get a complete picture of what we're talking about. We're getting into some pretty wild terrain, from cryptography to conspiracies. We're going to deal with the occult. But I've done my best to really stick to the facts and give you some practical answers to some of the most controversial questions in this field. By the end of this video, you should know: what's the hidden joke in this notoriously wonky portrait of Shakespeare? What was Ben Jonson's secret motive for being buried vertically in Westminster Abbey? What types of encryption were Elizabethans really practicing, and how do they show up in these texts? What were the intentions of the powerful men who propped up the Stratford myth more than 100 years after Edward de Vere's death? And as an added bonus, how does this statue connect to George Washington? And why does Ben Jonson remind me of Professor Snape from Harry Potter? Buckle up. This is the 3 burials of Edward de Vere, how the real Shakespeare was erased and replaced. Part 1. Horatio. So as I mentioned before, we're focusing today less on the case for de Vere as Shakespeare and more on the cover-up. So for more on de Vere as Shakespeare, you can check out my other videos. But here we're going to be focusing more on the figures around de Vere, primarily Ben Jonson. Ben Jonson is a tough guy to get to know due to his lifelong obsession with secrecy. But he's important because he's basically the quarterback of the team effort to preserve Edward de Vere's legacy when it's being threatened with erasure. Ben Jonson was seemingly the creative director of the 1623 First Folio, for which he wrote the majority of the introductory material, and he also wrote the poem that adorns the Stratford-upon-Avon monument near where Will of Stratford is supposed to be buried. We'll come back to this. But first, let's lay out some of the most surprising facts about his life, which will actually give us a decent skeleton of his involvement with Edward de Vere. Did you know that Ben Jonson was buried vertically upside down in Westminster Abbey? This was thought to be a myth for a long time, but it's actually true. This is highly unusual, and even in his lifetime, nobody really understood why he was doing it. He joked about being too broke to buy more space, or he was saying he didn't want to take up too much room, and there were a lot of apocryphal stories and legends attached to this fact, but no conclusive explanations. So let's remember as we move forward that Ben Jonson specifically chose to be buried in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey, vertically. Here's another Ben Jonson fun fact. In 1598, he got away with murder.
What murder?
I'll take a moment to mention here that despite the sunny image we have of Elizabethan theater, this was a rough world. You had to be a bit of a risk taker to get involved with it professionally, particularly because this was not a society that protected free speech. In fact, government censorship was brutal, especially as Queen Elizabeth got older and older with no clear heir to succeed her. At this point, it was literally illegal to publicly question who the next monarch might be, or if there might be a civil war, or if the Protestant country was about to flip Catholic again. You couldn't even ask. The reason that common people were flocking to the theaters was not just for entertainment, but because this was the one place that you might get some news, cleverly disguised as a parable about ancient Greece, or maybe a story that takes place in the animal kingdom. So, in 1597, young Ben Jonson and Edward de Vere co-wrote the scandalous and likely seditious play Isle of Dogs. De Vere signed the play as Thomas Nash, and though an arrest warrant was placed for the fictional Nash, de Vere's immunity as a nobleman ensured that no arrest ever took place. Ben Jonson, as a commoner, wasn't so lucky, and he went to Marshalsea Prison, alongside 2 of the actors, Robert Shaw and Gabriel Spencer. A year later, Ben Jonson lands back in prison for killing Gabriel Spencer in a duel. Jonson beat the manslaughter charge and narrowly avoided hanging thanks to the invocation of an obscure legal loophole, and the fact that people appeared to be strangely reluctant to testify against him. Robert Prechter has posited that maybe de Vere intervened to help Jonson beat the rap. De Vere knew the law backwards and forwards thanks to his legal schooling, and De Vere had the clout and influence to intimidate Johnson's enemies against testifying. If De Vere had intervened to save his young protege's life, this would have been a defining moment in their relationship. I think De Vere may have been especially inclined to help if Spencer and Johnson's duel might have been related to bad blood resulting from the Isle of Dogs episode. Or even perhaps if Johnson had been defending De Vere's interests in his confrontation with Spencer. Whatever happened behind the scenes, Ben Jonson narrowly avoided being hanged, escaping with nothing more than a brand on his hand, which he would bear for the rest of his life. But this would be far from his last close scrape with the law. Another strange fact about Ben Jonson is that he was simultaneously King James's most prominent poet laureate while maintaining a decades-long association with James's greatest enemies. In 1605, a year after De Vere's death, Ben Jonson was once again imprisoned alongside John Marston and George Chapman for writing the play Eastward Ho, which contained anti-Jamesian sentiments as well as what scholar Catherine Children has identified as a flattering portrayal of Edward de Vere, disguised in the character of Touchstone. This play seems to have really upset the authorities because Johnson's situation in prison was so dire that Johnson's mother was reportedly preparing to smuggle him poison to kill him, as well as to poison herself. But before such measures became necessary, King James's chief advisor, Robert Cecil, was persuaded by Johnson's letters to let Jonson go free. And the next time we see Ben Jonson, he is at a dinner party with the key conspirators of the gunpowder plot to blow up Parliament, only days before the plot was supposed to take place. He's literally breaking bread with Guy Fawkes, the guy from the V for Vendetta mask. It's like going to Starbucks with Osama bin Laden right before 9/11. You'd think this might have burnt some of his goodwill with King James and Robert Cecil, but this seemingly was not the case because right afterwards, Jonson is penning masks and entertainments for the most high-profile events at the royal court. What's going on here? Most mainstream scholars have entertained the idea that Jonson was likely a double agent, exploiting his connections in the dissident artist communities and the Catholic community to feed information to Robert Cecil and King James.
I will.
I think the evidence for this conclusion is overwhelming, but the question remains, where did Jonson's loyalties really lie? Were they with the royal court, where he earned his living? Or was he secretly working against the monarchy's interests for decades, under their noses? Another Ben Jonson fact. In 1601, he contributed a poem to one of the most mysterious poetry collections in Elizabethan England, which announces to the world that Queen Elizabeth has a secret child at large who has not been named the heir to the throne. 1601 was a tense year in Elizabethan England. Queen Elizabeth is getting long in the tooth, and King James of Scotland's path to the throne is looking more and more clear. This is kind of crazy because Queen Elizabeth literally cut off James's mom's head. And people really don't want him, but royal blood is royal blood. At this time, Edward de Vere produces Love's Martyr, or Rosalind's Complaint, which purports to be a translation of an Italian poet Torquato Cailiano, but no such Italian poet exists, and this was merely an attempt to deflect from the poem's scandalous content, all of which was original. In this volume is William Shakespeare's The Phoenix and the Turtle, which tells the story of a tragic love affair between the phoenix and the turtle dove, which resulted in a secret child. Ben Jonson contributes some verses to this volume, as do Chapman and Marston, with whom he will be in prison for the Eastward Ho scandal 4 years later. Hank Whittemore, Catherine Children, and other Oxfordians have interpreted the story of the Phoenix and the Turtle as an allegory about Queen Elizabeth and Edward de Vere's romantic relationship in the 1570s, as well as the secret Prince Tudor that was born from their union, identified as Henry Wriothesley, the Earl of Southampton. It's Henry Wriothesley to whom Shakespeare dedicates several works and who is widely believed by mainstream scholarship to be the fair youth of Shakespeare's sonnets. By collaborating with de Vere on this risky venture, Jonson is clearly throwing in his lot with Edward de Vere, and he appears to be intimately in his confidence. Hank Whittemore's The Monument beautifully relates how Shakespeare's sonnets are essentially de Vere's autobiography of this time period. They are covertly documenting how the Dark Lady, Queen Elizabeth, betrayed de Vere and their son, the fair youth, allowing him to languish in prison while her advisor Robert Cecil, the model for the villainous Richard III, installed James of Scotland to England's throne. Whittemore posits that the sonnets were smuggled into Henry Wriothesley's prison cell daily, while de Vere maneuvered to prevent his execution. I will propose as well that Ben Jonson might have additionally written a deeply felt ode to Henry Wriothesley, Earl of Southampton, during the time of his imprisonment after his participation in the disastrous failed Essex Rebellion of 1601.
But to yourself, most loyal lord, O then, my best loved, let me importune that you will stand as far from all revolt as you are now from fortune.
This poem wasn't published until 1641, after Jonson's death, where it is coyly described as a poem
writ in Queen Elizabeth's time, since lost and recovered.
The ode is officially addressed to Lord Desmond, who was imprisoned in the Tower the year before the Essex Rebellion, but there's little evidence to support the notion that Desmond was ever Johnson's best love. And even Johnson biographer Ian Donaldson questions whether the dedication to Desmond is intended as a misdirect, due to the poem being politically hot-button. Incidentally, Ben Jonson has many instances throughout his career of being really shifty with regards to the timing of his publications, or being ambiguous about whose names get attached to the works, and we're going to see more of this going forward. Let's jump to 1603. Queen Elizabeth has just died, leaving the throne to King James, and De Vere is heartbroken and bereft. As De Vere writes to his brother-in-law Robert Cecil,
"In this common shipwreck, mine is above all the rest. She hath left to try my fortune among the alterations of time and chance."
Now it's 1604. King James is on the throne, and Shakespeare's writings, which cryptically celebrate the hidden Prince Tutor, threaten to destabilize the entire government. Shakespeare's plays, which have been coming out regularly, will suddenly stop being published for 20 years. De Vere's health, finances, and reputation have never been in worse shape. De Vere's death at age 54 was chalked up to the plague, but he would have been at low risk of exposure in his countryside estate in Hackney, where he'd been editing his works in seclusion for years. He left no will, and there was no funeral. Suicide in Elizabethan England would have meant the forfeiture of all your assets to the state, a fate that De Vere had already suffered in his childhood as a ward of court. Is it possible that our Hamlet had suffered too much and decided not to be? The Elizabethan world was strangely silent when De Vere was buried in a church in Hackney, in a simple grave that his wife Elizabeth Trentham felt was significantly below his just deserts. And King James and his advisor Robert Cecil began a smear campaign to discredit De Vere on the public stage, escalating what has been remembered by history as poetomachia, or the War of the Poets. Webster and Dekker, who are hack writers in the government's employ, churn out hit pieces, attacking De Vere as the lascivious Earl in Westward Ho. And as we've seen, Jonson punches back, teaming up quickly with Marston and Chapman to defend De Vere's name with Eastward Ho, and he's arrested and threatened with torture for his trouble. When Webster and Dekker respond with Northward Ho, Jonson doesn't retaliate, as by this point he's already cut a deal with Robert Cecil. But what is Jonson really up to? Jonson collaborates with Cecil in foiling the gunpowder plot and watches as his fellow Catholics are sent to their executions. But in the days that follow, he is tasked with finding a Catholic priest and delivering him to the government. Jonson is a resourceful man with many contacts in the Catholic underground, and yet he doesn't bring home the bacon. His letter to Robert Cecil is sheepishly apologetic. Whoops, Jonson hasn't managed to track the priest down. Naturally, he's anxious to convince Cecil that he gave it his best shot, saying,
"May it please your lordship to understand that there hath been no want in me either of labour or sincerity in the discharge of this business."
But maybe we should question his sincerity. Because soon after the gunpowder plot, Ben Jonson's got a new play out on the boards, 1605's Volpone or the Fox, widely considered to be a satire of the Machiavellian Robert Cecil himself. Cecil is mocked in poems as Volpone after his death, and the play is published in 1607 with a number of prefatory poems by Catholic recusants and political dissidents, alongside whom Jonson had been fined and tried. Many of these poems are signed by initials in the first print run, but they'll be signed with full names when they're published again after Robert Cecil's death. Clearly, the writers of the poems are balancing a desire to stand in support of Jonson's satire with the danger of being associated with his work. And I'll mention as an aside here, one myth about Ben Jonson that's damaged his reputation is the fact that his publications often had many prefatory poems and explanatory materials, which modern scholars have found pompous or egotistical. In fact, Jonson was adding these materials in order to be able to make calculated political statements. And of course, the other big myth about Jonson was that he was the jealous rival of his contemporary Shakespeare, whose works he mocked on the stage. We know, of course, that De Vere was Jonson's senior by 22 years, and that Jonson's allusions to Shakespeare's works on stage are always loyal homages to his mentor. Fact about Ben Jonson. Jonson was known to have styled himself after Horace, considering himself to be the Elizabethan age's answer to the Roman lyric poet. In 1601, government asset Dekker had previously targeted Ben Jonson, parodying him as the character Horace in his play Satyromastics. Oxfordians have wondered whether Jonson is Horatio, to whom Hamlet delivers his final anguished plea.
"O good Horatio, what a wounded name! Things standing thus unknown shall live behind me. If thou didst ever hold me in thy heart, absent thee from felicity a while, and in this harsh world draw thy breath in pain to tell my story.
Because for the rest of his life, that seems to be what Ben Jonson does. Part 2. As a Scout. Like many Elizabethans, Jonson had a Latin motto, tanquam explorator, or as a scout. It was an apt phrase for a man renowned for his intellectual curiosity, but as is typical with Jonson, there was a deeper layer of meaning. The tag tanquam explorator came from a quotation from Seneca.
For I am wont to cross over into the enemy's camp, not as a deserter, but as a scout.
From the time he cut his 1604 prison deal with Robert Cecil, Jonson had been living in the enemy's camp, producing a wide array of entertainments extolling the glories of the Jacobean regime. Jonson was cantankerous and a drunk, often deriding the lavish propaganda spectacles he was responsible for producing.
Oh, shows, mighty shows, the eloquence of masks. What need of prose or verse or sense to express immortal you?
The life of a double agent is lonely, and in his bitter, caustic persona, I hear echoes of Professor Snape from the Harry Potter book series, who must similarly operate in the enemy's camp. Years later, he would tell William Drummond that he had wished he had become a churchman so that he could just once make one honest sermon to the king.
I careth not what thereafter should befall me, for I would not flatter though I saw death.
In 1609, Ben Jonson's most trusted publisher, Thomas Thorpe, publishes Shakespeare's Sonnets, spreading the story of how Prince Tudor was cast aside and remains at large. The sonnets are also prefaced with this mysterious dedication, which we will return to in a bit. And still Jonson played his part at court, and still he remained in favor. When Robert Cecil needed a competent writer for an event of state, Ben Jonson was his first call. Jonson even wrote 2 poems flattering Robert Cecil while Cecil remained in office. But after Cecil's death, Jonson republished the poems, back to back, as
To Robert, Earl of Salisbury,
and
to the same upon the accession of the treasureship to him.
But these 2 poems are followed then immediately by a new poem that seemed to express his true feelings. To My Muse begins,
Away and leave me, thou thing most abhorred, that hast betrayed me to a worthless lord, made me commit most fierce idolatry to a great image through thy luxury.
Jonson is careful not to state the name of this worthless lord, but by placing this poem after the previous 2, the reader is left with little doubt. Jonson spent years biding his time so that he might, like Horatio, tell Edward de Vere's story. After the daring 1609 publication of Shakespeare's sonnets, several years go by with no action. But the 1612 death of Robert Cecil might have signaled a change in the winds, and Jonson began to plot again. When we last left our friend Edward de Vere, he was pushing up daisies in a small church in Hackney. Or, more precisely, he was resting in this fairly unimpressive tomb, which his wife had complained was not fitting his degree. The censorship climate during the ascension of King James was so intense that he'd received no eulogies, as people feared getting on the wrong side of Robert Cecil's administration. England's greatest poet had been served a massive injustice, and it would seem that Ben Jonson and his Confederates were looking to correct that. This is Westminster Abbey, the magnificent cathedral that is the final resting place of all of Great Britain's greatest heroes. And here's the section of the Abbey that was soon to become known as Poets' Corner, though at this point it only housed Geoffrey Chaucer and Edmund Spenser, 2 giants of English letters. In the coming decades, Poets' Corner would fill up with the graves of some of de Vere's closest associates, including Ben Jonson, Francis Beaumont, Michael Drayton, and Hugh Holland, who contributed verses to Shakespeare's First Folio. And it's here that scholar Alexander Waugh suggests that Edward de Vere was covertly moved by his friends to find his final resting place in the year 1619. So some of this evidence is straightforward. The next year, Oxford's first cousin, Percival Golding, records that Oxford was
a man in mind and body, absolutely accomplished, with honourable endowments, who died at his house in Hackney in the month of June, anno 1604, and lieth buried at Westminster.
But some of the evidence is a bit more cryptic. This is the church in Stratford-upon-Avon where the country gentleman William Shakespeare was said to have been buried after his death in 1616. There are all kinds of extremely weird features of this burial site, and Waugh contends that it was designed in typical Johnsonian fashion, with a superficial layer that deflects suspicion and a deeper message for the initiated. Let's start with what's supposedly Shakespeare's grave, although to be clear, it doesn't say Shakespeare's name on it anywhere. A ground-penetrating radar scan in 2016 showed that it was only 3 feet deep and didn't find any evidence of human remains. This grave simply isn't large enough to have contained an adult male corpse, and that might be why it's inscribed with this forbidding message.
Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones.
So this is a pretty clear injunction against looking inside this grave, and the allusion to moving my bones is intriguing. But what does it mean? Fortunately, the funerary monument next to this grave is a lot more talkative, thanks to a poetic inscription by Ben Jonson. Now, I'd like to pause our story here and talk a bit about codes, because we're now moving into territory in which people were working desperately hard to communicate their message without detection. So meanings are about to get a lot more ambiguous. Codes and ciphers are some of the most controversial topics in the world of Shakespeare authorship studies, because they're somewhat in the eye of the beholder, and also because the idea of secret codes feels very tinfoil hat today. Nowadays in our modern world, regular people don't really think about cryptography, but that's largely because it's been made invisible in our lives, thanks to our messages being transmitted via computer devices, which automatically provide their own sophisticated encryptions. So it's out of sight and out of mind for us, but for an Elizabethan person, anytime they had to share a written message, especially one of a sensitive nature, it stood a risk of being intercepted. People had much more familiarity with basic types of ciphers, and furthermore, in this highly literate and poetic society, literary code breaking was something of a fad. People used anagrams and riddle poems the way that someone today might play Wordle or do the New York Times crossword puzzle every week. Having said that, the Shakespeare authorship question does kind of deserve its fishy reputation for being a little too enthusiastic about secret codes. So before we keep going with secret prince tutors and grave robbing, I want to give you some sort of basis in the facts. We're going to sort facts from fiction and provide you with some orientation around how Elizabethans did and did not use codes. Now, you may or may not be aware that the Baconian thesis, which posits that Edward de Vere's cousin by marriage, Francis Bacon, was Shakespeare, it was founded on the premise that there were secret codes in Shakespeare's works. People started looking for a hidden aristocratic Shakespeare as early as the 1800s, and Francis Bacon was the first guy that really took off as an authorship candidate. Francis Bacon's writings about statecraft and espionage mention the usages of different types of coded systems, and this led to an absolute mania for searching for Bacon's codes in Shakespeare's works. In fact, today's NSA actually has its roots in a bunch of Baconian codebreaker librarians who were enlisted by the government in World War II to decipher purple, which was Japan's version of the Enigma code. Though they succeeded against the Japanese, unfortunately, these extremely capable and brilliant men couldn't crack Shakespeare. To this day, many people have tried to find Baconian ciphers in Shakespeare's works, but despite their best efforts, their results were never replicable or convincing to many beyond the person who had supposedly found the cipher in the first place. All these Baconian cipher red herrings made it seem like Shakespeare authorship nuts were crying wolf, and in 1920, when J.T. Loney recovered Edward de Vere from the dustbin of history, the public was a lot less receptive to his message due to the stigma around all these codes. The Baconians were especially excited by the fact that the page numbers in the first folio are super messed up, and these discrepancies were thought to hold great significance. You will never again hear me attribute anything in the Renaissance period to error because these were incredibly careful and bright people, but my take on the mispaginations in the first folio is that the printers were rushing like crazy due to circumstances we're going to outline later, and also mass publication of print media was in his infancy. Basically, I think it's kind of random. This wasn't a slow, careful art like some of the engravings that we're going to look at, in which case everything is intentional. But my whole take on this subject changed the day that I learned that printers of Shakespeare's sonnets would interchangeably use a W with two V's, or even two lowercase v's, depending on what letters they had available. Are you following?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Another issue I have with the Baconian ciphers is honestly, they're too hard to break. And if the US's intelligence war cabinet couldn't find what they were trying to say, then this was probably an inefficient system for conveying a secret message. Once I start getting into the types of codes that Elizabethans really were using to communicate with one another, you'll get a sense of the level of difficulty and ambiguity that they were accustomed to operating on. It's simultaneously wittier and less elaborate. I think for our purposes, these codes were developed by men of letters to speak to other men of letters, and as such, they were more likely to traffic in linguistic tricks and classical learning than numerical ones. One example of this type of encryption that shows up repeatedly is referencing a classical text but subtly tweaking it so that the learned people familiar with this text will notice the adjustment. Machiavelli may have actually done this when he talks about David going to fight Goliath with his slingshot and his knife. Most people would look at that passage and keep walking, thinking it looks normal. But if you're well educated and you're reading this alertly, it's going to stick out to you that in the Bible, David didn't bring a knife. In fact, it's really emphasized that he isn't afraid to face the fearsome giant Goliath with just his slingshot because he knows that God will protect him. So what Machiavelli is saying is actually pretty shocking and even heretical, that his methods will, in a sense, oppose the Bible, saying, don't just trust in God, read my book and bring a knife. Ben Jonson will use this method of encryption to talk about Edward de Vere occasionally, as per Alexander Waugh's research, and Roger Strittmatter showed how Francis Mears used a similar technique to identify de Vere as Shakespeare. Another popular encryption technique is anagrams. As far as I've come across, anagrams are mostly used to disguise people's names in a provocative and tantalizing way. The usage for these reminds me of how pop artists today might release diss tracks or love songs about other celebrities, but they want to let the fans figure out who they're talking about rather than stating it explicitly. For example, Robert Prechter identified that Edward de Vere's sonnet sequence, Emeric Dulphy, is actually based around an anagram. Emeric Dulphy shuffles out to Dame Lucifer, which would have referred to Queen Elizabeth, and that's a pretty juicy reveal. Emeric Dulphy sticks out as a weird enough name that people would have known it might contain a scandalous secret, and they'd be willing to play around with it until they landed on the right answer. So that's kind of how that game was played around court, and you can tell it's fairly simple. Another simple technique is double entendre, and that was also used for aristocratic poets to be coy about the fact that they had an eye on a cutie at court. We know today that Philip Sidney's most famous love poems were actually written for Lady Penelope Rich, who was married to the wealthy but unattractive Lord Rich. See if you can catch the subtle message.
But that rich fool who by blind fortune's lot the richest gem of love and life enjoys, and can with foul abuse such beauties blot, grow in only folly rich.
Scandal-ridden Penelope Rich actually inspired a lot of coveted poetry. This acrostic poem was written after she divorced Lord Rich and got together with her longtime lover, the Earl of Devonshire. The poem appears to be respectfully celebrating her new title as Countess of Devonshire, but look closer.
It's a very interesting poem because although what it says is quite boring and it's in praise of Penelope Rich, it's also being very, very rude about her, but in a very secret way. And the way you discover that it's being rude about her is you follow the capital letters. So along the left-hand column you can see it says Penelope down, capital letters, and then you can read Countess on the 5th line, of on the 6th line, Devonshire. Now this in itself was highly controversial. In those days you couldn't get a divorce very easily, and she was actually married to Lord Rich, hence she's called Penelope Rich, but she somehow wangled a divorce and got herself to marry a man who became Earl of Devonshire, so she called herself Countess of Devonshire. And a lot of people at the time said she can't call herself that, she's got no right. But anyway, the fun bit about this is if you carry on with the capital letters, you see C-O-I-T-U-I, coitui, which in Latin means for a fuck.
So you're starting to see how people in this milieu are using codes to subtly publish court gossip or even subversive messages, and they're typically literary rather than numerical codes. They might be in English or maybe Latin, and they all draw attention to themselves to highlight one secret piece of information that the reader is primed to search for by the presence of dissonance in the text.
Your anagrams are showing, Doctor.
There is one exception to this, and it's a group of people who were using numbers as a meditative practice. It's a form of Christian Kabbalah. However, with this Kabbalistic practice, you're not trying to pass a message to another person. The message is always the divinity of Christ, and your goal is to make the most elaborate web of numbers and symbols possible in order to deepen your immersion into Christ consciousness. For example, Thomas Tresham was a Catholic dissident who built this triangular building in 1593 as an expression of his faith in the Trinity. You can see how he covers the building with different symbolic representations of Christ. He also made a similar decoration on a window of a building he was being imprisoned in for being a Catholic, and in fact, his jailers made it difficult for him and were trying to mess it up. So I think this type of numerical Kabbalah exercise makes a lot of sense if you're going to jail for your religion and you're going to have a lot of time to reflect on why you're there. But it's not intended to communicate a complicated message to another person. And what about John Dee, the mathematician and astrologer who helped Queen Elizabeth to choose her coronation date? Alexander Waugh has developed a beautifully intricate decryption of the dedication of Shakespeare's sonnets based on the theory that John Dee's encrypted them through geometric principles. I spent a lot of time looking into this and highly recommend you do the same because it's an exhilarating ride through Waugh's genius. But my conclusion was that I don't actually think Dee was particularly involved with Edward de Vere or the Shakespeare authorship question. And I also don't think numbers are necessary to break these codes, which were written by men of letters who had to operate much more simply in order to get their message across. Hank Whittemore's decryption of the mysterious sonnet dedication relies mostly on double entendre, and to me hews more closely to the spirit of what the publishers were trying to convey in 1609. It continues to play on the same words that are used to identify Henry Wriothesley and Edward de Vere within the text of the sonnets. And to me it makes sense that the coded message would be intended to communicate A, who wrote the sonnets, and B, who they're really about, subtly enough to evade the censors. So, okay, hopefully you've calibrated a bit into the somewhat Straussian approach I've adopted in reading these hidden messages, in which the esoteric text is generally as simple as it can possibly be without risking political persecution. And now we're ready to go back to this slightly bizarre grave site in Stratford-upon-Avon with an empty 3-foot-deep grave threatening to curse you if you excavate it. And let's look back at the monument next to it with this poem by Ben Jonson. Alexander Waugh reads this as a riddle poem, hinting to the reader where Shakespeare is really buried.
Stay, passenger. Why goest thou by so fast? Read, if thou canst, whom envious death hath placed within this monument. Shakespeare, with whom quick nature did, whose name doth deck this tomb. Far more than cost, sich all that he hath writ, leaves living art but page to serve his wit.
In the first line of the Latin, he identifies these as the 3 other poets who are in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey: Geoffrey Chaucer, Edmund Spenser, and Francis Beaumont, Beaumont having just died in 1616. And this tracks with 2 poems we have from that time period, one by Ben Jonson and one by William Bass, where they're kind of saying that they're in Poets' Corner and they're pushing around tombs, trying to make space for Edward de Vere.
My Shakespeare, rise! I will not lodge thee by Chaucer or Spenser, or bid Beaumont lie a little further, to make thee a room. Thou art a monument without a tomb. Renowned Spenser, lie a thought more nigh to learned Chaucer, and rare Beaumont lie a little nearer Spenser, to make room for Shakespeare in your 3-fold, 4-fold tomb.
As a side note, 1616 is the year Will of Stratford is supposed to have died, although we know very little about his death, and it doesn't seem like his body is there in Stratford-upon-Avon, so I would love to know more about where he ends up if anyone else wants to look into it. Waugh's done a really great job decrypting this riddle poem, and I think we can see that the encryption is literary, it's relying on clever wordplay and double entendre contained within a rhyming verse, which is very challenging to pull off, as well as there are these Latin scholarly allusions. And I think that's a good model in general for how Ben Jonson rolls as we move forward, because we see Ben Jonson making fun of a fad of posh young men who think they're being really clever, dabbling in all these encryptions. He writes a poem called The New Cry, making fun of them.
To write in cipher, they have found the sleight, with juice of lemons, onions, piss to write.
So yeah, I think Jonson is looking down on these crude techniques like piss and onions, and he feels proud that his own methodology is subtler. I do think that there are more secrets here, and so I wanted to look into the second line of Latin text. Olympus stuck out to me as an interesting word that might also have an English equivalent, because Olympus isn't where you go when you die, it's actually more of a pantheon of living gods as well as the muses. And so I thought that perhaps Olympus could refer to Poets' Corner as a hall of fame. And I thought maybe Populi could in some way refer to this group of poets that rallies behind de Vere, although I haven't found a connection yet. And my editor, Linz, wondered if Terra in some way meant England, but that's as far as we've gotten, so I'd love to hear your thoughts. Also, I thought that the final line, leaves living art but page to serve his wit, could be another double entendre. Page meaning servant, as in, Edward de Vere's legacy was so impressive that he left all the living artists behind him to become servants to his wit in posterity. Okay, so we made it to the 1620s, and in the 15 years since de Vere's death, Ben Jonson has successfully published his sonnets and also moved him from his second-rate burial in Hackney to a worthy resting place in Westminster Abbey. And Jonson is feeling the stress from his work, and he's a raging alcoholic, but he's doing a pretty good job as Horatio under these circumstances. But he should not rest on his laurels, because we are approaching the Spanish marriage crisis, and Edward de Vere's youngest child, Henry de Vere, is in prison for standing up to King James in Parliament. And James's closest advisors are plotting to cut his head off. I'm not going to get too deep into this conflict, but in a nutshell, King James has run up spectacular debts, and he thinks that building an alliance with Catholic Spain can help bail him out. And he's appeasing these Spaniards who have literally infiltrated the English government and are undermining their interests from within. The Spanish ambassador Gondomar was responsible for convincing James to execute one of my favorite Elizabethans, Sir Walter Raleigh, because Raleigh was an English war hero against the Spanish, and the Spaniards found him threatening and wanted him out of the way. So James is wrongfully murdering an English hero in the hopes of appeasing the Spanish into bailing him out of his debts. It's pretty treasonous and frankly pretty nauseating. I really don't like King James. Right now, this same guy Gondomar now has his eye on executing Henry de Vere for the same reason. Here's a letter that Gondomar writes back to Spain.
I told King James to arrest this man and put him in the Tower, in a narrow cell so that no one can speak to him. I have a strong desire to cut off his head, because he is an extremely malicious person and has followers. And he is a second-ranking earl in England, and he and his followers are committed.
So we can see that de Vere's son is legitimately in great peril, and what's more is that the entire faction at court that's opposing James's agenda is basically a who's who of Edward de Vere's living friends and relatives. It's the Earls of Pembroke and Montgomery, both of whom were engaged to Edward de Vere's daughters, and Henry Wriothesley, the Earl of Southampton, and presumably more people behind the scenes. With the clock ticking for Henry de Vere in prison, in 1623 Ben Jonson rushes to make a strong statement that will oppose King James and rally support behind the English national identity now under threat from Spanish influence. Edward de Vere had been the leading voice of that bygone Elizabethan era, but his works had been suppressed for the past 2 decades. To publish Edward de Vere's works, with their many allusions to past government scandals as well as to the living Prince Tudor, would have been a treasonous action worthy of the death penalty. So Ben Jonson, the master of doublespeak and secrecy, devised a maneuver that would allow him to release de Vere's plays without explicitly challenging the government's legitimacy. It would require the creation of a false identity for the author, convincing enough that the plays would seem to most people to have been divorced from their original context. When he was alive, Edward de Vere had seemingly hired Will of Stratford as a frontman, similar to how an ancient Roman senator had hired a 20-year-old African slave named Terence to be the public face of his works. De Vere's wife's will had made a provision for the continued allowance for her dumb man, and John Davies of Hereford had written a poem calling Shakespeare our English Terence. But Jonson would go even further, creating Shakespeare's first folio, a greatest hits compendium of dozens of plays from Edward de Vere's life at court, accompanied by a series of documents intending to solidify the idea that the writer was a simple country gentleman with no connections at all to the English aristocracy. The first folio contained introductory materials penned by Jonson, but signed by the illiterate actors Hemmings and Condell, in order to further establish the connection to Will of Stratford. However, the folio did not disguise that it had been paid for by the Earls of Pembroke and Montgomery, family by marriage to Edward de Vere and the most outspoken opponents of James's administration and the Spanish marriage. Right around the time of the first folio's publication, Jonson announced to the world that he'd suffered a desk fire, which had sadly destroyed much of the writing that he'd been working on. Oops. Gabriel Redi suggested that this desk fire might have in fact been for the purposes of destroying the evidence, namely the manuscripts of more than 30 contraband plays by Edward de Vere. But there's another key player who has been largely overlooked by history. Jonson had likely obtained de Vere's manuscripts from Susan de Vere, the youngest of de Vere's 3 daughters, who was likely the inspiration for King Lear's loyal daughter, Cordelia. Susan was married to the Earl of Montgomery, but she had far more of a literary reputation than he did, and scholar Bonner Cutting has suggested that Susan became the literal face of the First Folio project. In fact, a recent discovery by Cutting has revolutionized our understanding of this historically baffling and bizarre portrait of the artist called Shakespeare. The publication of the First Folio seems to have been a resounding success. The Spanish match fell apart, and Henry de Vere walked free from prison. But not everyone seems to have been pleased with it, or the lengths that Jonson had gone to erase the author from their works. A year later, in 1624, Gervase Markham lamented that a member of the de Vere family had been injured by a pen whose blanching might make the whole world forgetful. Ben Jonson, for his part, was also growing weary from the burdens he had shouldered to preserve de Vere's memory. Reflecting on his experience compiling de Vere's works, he wrote,
I remember the players have often mentioned it as an honour to Shakespeare, that in his writing, whatsoever he penned, he never blotted out a line. My answer hath been, would he had blotted 1,000, which they thought a malevolent speech. I love the man, and do honour his memory on this side idolatry as much as any. Well, he was indeed honest, and of an open and free nature. Had an excellent fancy, brave notions, and gentle expressions, wherein he flowed with that facility that sometime it was necessary he should be stopped.
But after the many sacrifices he'd made for De Vere throughout his life, Johnson would make one more with his death. Johnson confounded everyone with the odd request that he should be buried vertically in Poets' Corner at Westminster Abbey, and refused to give a straight answer as to why. Still to this day, Johnson's biographers are baffled by his strange choice of burial. But it seems to me that Johnson's motives were quite straightforward. He knew that he and his conspirators had bid Beaumont lie a little further to make the Aroon, and that there was one more tomb in Poets' Corner than had officially been accounted for. And so I think it's plausible that Johnson was strategically placing his vertical tomb in a way that would prevent the accidental exposure of De Vere's resting place. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this theory.
Remember that William Shakespeare said, "The whole world is a stage. All the people are merely players and actors."
Okay, so we've covered a lot of territory, and now you've seen two burials of Edward de Vere, the first at Hackney and the second in Westminster Abbey, but I promised you three. So this third one's going to be more of a metaphorical burial, and it actually takes place more than 100 years later, as a new circle of poets and aristocrats in England are grappling with a major question of national identity. If you're trying to get the truth out that Edward de Vere wrote Shakespeare, one of the biggest obstacles that you face is a very strange fact. Not only was de Vere published under a pseudonym during his life and after his lifetime, but a century after his death, there was seemingly a coordinated effort by an elite group of artists and aristocrats to solidify and even fabricate evidence evolving the myth of Will of Stratford. What's even stranger is that it seems that these people actually knew the truth and yet took steps to mislead the public. There has been a massive amount of confusion about what motivated this, so I'm going to attempt to clear things up. The century after Edward de Vere's death is a bitch for English politics. Can I say that?
Yes.
Okay. You have a civil war and a king gets his head chopped off, and there's a massive amount of economic turmoil and many foreign wars. And as the 18th century goes on, there's a definitive sense of cultural malaise in England. I'm going to draw a contrast. Like, in the Renaissance period, you have the building of a national story, but in the 18th century, sarcasm and satire are all the rage. You can see this in the works of the most prominent writers, Jonathan Swift and Alexander Pope. Behind this snarky, bitchy tone that pervades the literature is a sense that things aren't quite what they used to be, and England's glory days might well be in the past. People in England are looking backwards, trying to recapture their nationalist spirit, especially with the German Hanover dynasty on the throne, and there's a culture war raging about how to define English identity. Meanwhile, there are massive tensions within Parliament. You have Robert Walpole amassing a huge amount of power and essentially functioning as England's first prime minister, and there's a fierce backlash against Walpole and his policies by a diversely affiliated group of elites who identify themselves as a patriot opposition. This isn't a very good metaphor, but you can kind of look at how people in Hollywood felt about Donald Trump when he got elected in 2016, and the very energized #resistance movement that inspired a lot of art and activism. That's kind of how angry the patriot opposition are about Walpole and the direction that England's going in. And that's how committed they are to trying to stop him through a combination of legal action and public art. As I mentioned, a major front of this culture war battle ends up being the representation of England's historical heroes, and who gets to control their image and branding. In 1737, Walpole's camp pays to have an ostentatious bust of Milton placed in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey, with an even more ostentatious plaque next to it saying, "Hey guys, Robert Walpole's government paid for this and you're welcome." That same month, an anonymous letter in the newspaper insults the Milton bust, saying that a group of prominent patriot opposition figures are working on making a Shakespeare sculpture to place in Westminster Abbey as a rebuttal. It's also important to these patriots that the Shakespeare sculpture be funded by the people, so that they can make a statement contrasting the corrupt government's Milton propaganda bust with the impression that the Shakespeare sculpture represents the people's will. To this end, the patriot opposition holds a series of fundraiser performances of Shakespeare's plays for the public, but they still fall short of the money required to build the sculpture, and a wealthy lord ends up having to cover the bill. This group engages in a large number of activities to bolster the image of Shakespeare as their anti-government symbol, including adding a quill pen to Shakespeare's funerary monument in Stratford-upon-Avon to make him look more like a writer, and throwing a huge Jubilee festival there in 1769 to celebrate the supposed birthplace of the bard. All right, you guys, I made it pretty far into this presentation, but now I have to drop the F-bomb. Freemason. A number of prominent figures involved with this Shakespeare revivalist movement happen to have been high-ups in the Freemasons, and even leave little Freemason Easter eggs in what they're doing. Nowadays, talking about the Freemasons is kind of cliche conspiracy theory fare, but in the 18th century, the Freemasons were a very active and influential group, and their lodges were like exclusive clubhouses for elites to socialize in. I'm struggling to come up with the right analogy here, but today it's maybe kind of like the Scientologists in Hollywood, or the effective altruists in Silicon Valley, or maybe it's more like the Daughters of the American Revolution in the South. So how do we know that the Freemasons were actually involved in this? Well, because they're telling us, and very loudly. Look at the posture of William Shakespeare here with the crossed legs and the bent elbow. This is the posture of the Freemasons, taken from the Knights Templar, who were posing their bodies as the Chi Rho symbol of Christ. And as promised, here is Freemason George Washington standing in the exact same posture. Looking good, George. Look at where Shakespeare's finger is pointing. This passage is a misquotation from The Tempest, which is funny that it's misquoted in an engraving. And the finger is pointing to solemn temples, which is a reference to Solomon's Temple, the supposed origin of all of Freemasonry. In 1743, the group behind the Westminster Abbey sculpture placed another sculpture at Wilton House, the former home of one of the brothers who funded the first folio. You can see the same posture here, but the finger is now pointing to a different message: shadow player. This may be the Freemasons within the Patriot opposition boasting about how they are operating in the shadows. But could it also be an indicator that these people knew that Edward de Vere himself was the shadow player behind the puppet figure William Shakespeare? This begs the question, in the midst of all of their activities, did these people know that the real Shakespeare's identity had been buried? In my opinion, it's more than likely that they did. Some of Walpole's leading opponents were distant descendants of de Vere's relatives, including Robert and Edward Harley, the new Earls of Oxford. Furthermore, David Shakespeare makes a convincing case that the statue's face was modeled on an old portrait of Edward de Vere that had been passed down as a Harley family heirloom. So yet again, we have two layers of messaging. The unwashed masses wishing to pay homage to England's greatest literary hero, see Will, a commoner like them. But for elites in the know, this is a statue that reveals a secret. And it also solidifies their status as insiders with unique access to understanding Shakespeare. By the end of the 18th century, these elite men had built an entire phony cult around Will of Stratford. They published fake Shakespeare biographies, generated fake Shakespeare imagery, and even created fake Shakespeare rituals in Stratford-upon-Avon. All of this succeeded in making Shakespeare an English national icon, while simultaneously driving the truth of the authorship question deeper into the shadows. Today, as the authorship debate rages on, Edward de Vere's advocates have had to work really hard to overcome the misinformation generated from this time period. It may not be my place to judge, but if I'm interpreting things correctly, I think these 18th century wits did Edward de Vere dirty. In their haste to create an icon for their political movement, they buried de Vere deeper in lies. And while I'm sure they thought that they were honoring de Vere by making him the face of their cause, frankly, I find it a little grotesque to see Edward de Vere transformed into a political cartoon.
No. You have 40 years of the destruction of your colleagues to answer for. You've chosen to be, words fail me, an asshole.
Edward de Vere's motto was Vero nihil verius, or nothing is truer than truth. And yet throughout his life, and after his death, he was manipulated by liars. Ben Jonson and his collaborators were censored from speaking the truth under pain of death. But these 18th century men were completely at liberty to properly honor de Vere's legacy, and instead they chose to make him their mascot, using their knowledge as an elite form of currency that frankly feels a little smug. So that brings us to today. More than 400 years have passed since Edward de Vere's death, but he is still denied the legacy that he so richly deserves. In the years to come, I hope that the world can truly recognize this amazing man who faced so many trials in life, but who will always represent the pinnacle of what humans can achieve. Please let me know if there are any topics you'd like me to delve into more deeply. Thank you for your time. Please like and subscribe, and I hope you've enjoyed the 3 burials of Edward de Vere, how the real Shakespeare was erased and replaced.
Oh, shows, mighty shows, the eloquence of masks.
Thank you to these scholars and any that I have failed to mention for their incredible research.